For kids worship, so K through third can participate in the service from this point forward, oriented around their age group. If you've got little ones that might like to participate in that, we would encourage you just to get more information by following them out one Sunday. That being said, and here this morning we have an incredibly pertinent passage, just where we left off in the book of Zechariah chapter 13, for baptism this morning. It's almost like God planned it. So, I will pray that God will intervene in the reading of His Word, and then through the proclamation of His Word before we read. So would you first join me in prayer? Father, I love occasions of baptism because I believe they echo the very words of Zechariah. The Lord is my God. And so, Father, I pray this morning that you would help us to arrive at that same conclusion. And for those who have been baptized before, that they would see the significance of it in understanding how you work things out in our world. For those who have not come to know faith in Jesus Christ, I pray that their response to this passage would end up in the exact same place ultimately. That they would realize that it is an opportunity for them to acknowledge the Lord as my God, and at the same time, you reciprocate that with they are my people. And it's in your Son's name I ask these things. Amen. If you would, please join me. If you do not have a Bible, we're going to read from the one version that's right in front of you. There's a navy blue one. You could find Zechariah just to the left of Matthew or in the table of contents. And that Bible we would love to be a gift from us to you. So please feel free to take it with you. Nonetheless, we'll stand together as we read from Zechariah chapter 13, beginning in verse 2, just down to verse 9. 13:2. And on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, so that they shall be remembered no more. And also I will remove from the land the prophets and the spirit of uncleanness. And if anyone, again, prophesies, his father and mother who bore him, will say to him, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and mother who bore him shall pierce him through when he prophesies. And on that day, every prophet will be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. He will not put on a hairy cloak in order to deceive, but he will say, I am no prophet, I'm a worker of the soil. For a man sold me in my youth. And if one asks, what are these wounds on your back? He will say, the wounds I received in the house of my friends. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. And the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire and refine them, as one refines silver, and test them, as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is my God. Please be seated. Rather interesting passage in many ways, maybe a little foreign in some parts. But what is going on, to lay it out for you up front, Zechariah is saying, here's how God works in the world. Here's the way in which he works, you might say the system he has laid out. So I don't know if that helps you, but I think it can, if nothing else, eliminate some options we might hold on to at times that are inaccurate, wrong, intentionally deceptive even. Maybe let me back up. Sometimes, if you know how something works, it helps you to take advantage of it. So, for instance, board games. You sit down to play a board game. Usually, if somebody's going to play a board game, they'll say up front, how do you win? Right? We're all Americans. How do you win? And so I want to know, what's the goal of the game? And you say, okay, now how do you play the game? Kind of just give me the gist of it, the outline. I want to understand how to play it. Is it a card game, dice game? Do I have to move the number of spaces? How do you play it? And then the rest of the time, you're trying to figure out how to take advantage of that system. Well, that's not unique to board games. So my undergrad was in business. In business classes, they oftentimes talk about economic systems. The fun business classes would do kind of a mock trial run, if you will, in which you would play a simulated economic system as if you were a business owner. So I, for instance, would be the owner of Harley Davidson. Out of all, it was Colgate, Harley Davidson, or Disney. I got the cool one. And so I'm going to be Harley. How can we make Harley Davidson the most profitable? The whole deal was to understand how to take advantage of an economic system. So if you can spend money in advertising, research and development, and all these other ways, it really will produce a better gain in the end. So we spend all this time learning how to take advantage of a system. We interpret our world that way. All of us do, inevitably. How to get ahead in life is usually the phrase we use. Well, God is saying in this passage, here's how I work. That's what this passage is about. Here's how I work, so much so that he's actually telling you, and here's what it means for you to take advantage of this system. Now, he does it in kind of unique language that pertained most pertinently to people a few hundred years ago. But I think we'll be able to see it pretty easily, because here's what is fascinating about this passage. I would suggest to you, Jesus thought about this Old Testament passage more than any other single Old Testament passage. He thought over and over and over again, this is how my Father in heaven works. So I'm going to operate by that. So let's try to put it together. To do so, what he starts out with is there is an embarrassment to idols. And then he goes to, there's a shepherd who has been struck. Then he presents the people or the sheep have been scattered. So finally he says, here's what it would mean for you if you're going to be a strong people in the Lord. So it's a embarrassed by idols, struck shepherd, scattered sheep, and a strong people. So the embarrassed by idols, this first section, the previous section ended in verse 1, and so chapter 13, verse 2 is actually a new section. The people had a lot of idols. So idols had a lot of promoters. They called those promoters prophets. So let me, real quickly, people with their idols. Idols is a very simple biblical concept. Anything in life you would put in the place of or above God. That's it. Anything in life you would put in place of or above God. You might still want to hold on to God and Jesus, but if you have something that really you make your decisions by, that really trumps, is more pronounced in your life than God, it's an idol. John Calvin famously said, the bad news is our hearts are idol factories. We're constantly looking for something to put in the place of God. We're sure something else is going to give us a better advantage than God will. So idols in our lives today, you're probably familiar with them. We name TV shows about singers after them, and we are kind of an idol culture. So for instance, most often idols start out as legitimate good things, but then they take on a role they were never intended to take on. Some people can make an idol out of their spouse. They would serve their spouse before they'll serve God. They'll do for their spouse even if they know, really, per the Bible, I probably shouldn't go this route, or we probably should be more generous, but they're going to respond to their spouse first. An easy test, maybe. You should be able to say to your spouse, I love God way more than I love you. If that phrase stings a little bit, you may have your spouse as your God. Or sometimes it's possessions, one of the most common idols. This was not just common in our day, it was common back in their day. The only difference is they were more straight up about it. They would have a little figurine they would set on the windowsill over the kitchen sink so that while they're doing dishes, they thought, I wish I could have somebody else. I wish I was rich enough to have someone else do these dishes. And so they would ponder that looking at this idol. The constant desire for more is not unique to America. We point to it all the time in capitalism. But saying, if I could just get more, that desire for possessions can dominate our life. I think the unique thing for Americans is this: it's hard for us to see. It's in the air we breathe. So we really have a hard time processing it. When spending money to maintain your lifestyle goes against what the Bible says, but you do it anyways, possessions are your idol. It's pretty straightforward, I think, in many respects. Some people will even make children their idol. Oh no, now we're getting touchy. When children are our idol, we say things like, I would do anything for my kids, they're my whole world. Told you it was touchy. So when it comes to following the Bible or potentially offending my adult children, I would rather keep them around and ignore some parts. What he is saying is not just unique in Zechariah's day phenomena. He knows humanity, and he's speaking to it. So here's what he says. Here's where this gets rather fascinating. He says, what if there came a day in your life when people who are really into idols, they've got something they hold on to, something they value more than God? What if there came a day when just being in your presence made them want to deny idols? Just being in your presence. You're not doing anything unique or special. They're just with you, and they would kind of feel embarrassed about their idols. That's the scenario he describes. So he takes it all the way to the furthest degree. He says, remember people who promote idols in your life? He says, let's call them idol prophets. They come into your life, but now, because there's such a change in you, you're going to so follow God, and your faith in Jesus is so authentic that when they're in your presence, it just feels like a fraud. The faith you have in Jesus Christ and your trust of God is so real, so grounding, actually plays itself out, that they know they're nothing but idol hucksters. So when they're with you, they start to kind of deny it. Here's what he says, for instance, in verse 4. They get rid of their hairy cloaks. I know, it's bizarre. He says, because they don't want to pretend any longer. Elijah was considered the most famous prophet at the time. Elijah went around wearing a hairy cloak. Instead of saying hairy, that makes it sounds like he was a very furry man. All he's saying is he had a fur coat. So he said others would adopt fur coats. Fur coats for us are bougie. Fur coats for them were rugged. Okay, so think whatever rugged comes into your mind, Carhartt. And so they would wear these kind of rugged coats because that was kind of this rugged man who would be out in the wilderness and who would come into town with these prophecies from God. And everybody would think, oh, he seems so dedicated. Look at his clothes. Nobody would wear that intentionally. And so here we find ourselves with fur coats. So they would show up in their fur coats. Well, around you, it's so authentic, your faith in Jesus, that they're not even going to try with the fur coat anymore. They know it won't impress. Or he says in verse 5, there's this conversation he's describing. But he will say, I am no prophet. I am a worker of the soil, for a man sold me in my youth. What's going on is he's lying. He used to make his living by promoting idols. In your presence, he's to the point of feeling embarrassed about it. And you say, man, I thought you were really into fill in the blank. I say, no, I think you got me confused with somebody else. I haven't been into that since I was a kid, since my youth. Man, I don't do that. I'm a farmer. That's all I am. I'm just a farmer. I work the soil. He says in verse 6, and if one asks him, what are these wounds on your back? That's, again, sounds bizarre. What it was, to be real frank with you, it was self-mutilation. They would whip their back with straps, among other things, to demonstrate to the idols how devoted they were. Well, he's taken off his fur coat. You get a glimpse of his back. And you say, well, if you're not a prophet of idols, why do you have all the signs of somebody who's served an idol? What I love is he gives a half-truth. Half-truth. He says, oh, those scars, that was from being at the house of my friend. Well, it was the people he was friends with, the false gods. What he does is he says, those scars, no, they're from the house of my friends. If you took them seriously at all, think how ridiculous that is. Your friends left scars on your back? Those don't sound like friends. They sound more like siblings. So, in the end, what Zechariah is doing is saying, he says, there's going to come a day, if you really have authentic, true, real trust in Jesus Christ. People who've worshiped something else, lived for something else, are going to recognize it doesn't compare. So he presents this future vision, leaving you with the question, okay, how do I get there? What does it look like to end up in the position where I have such authentic faith that I'm not even trying, and people are around me and they think, man, I want what he has. And they start to pretend that there's somebody else even. That's a bizarre scenario, but nonetheless, what he's really encouraging you to is, how is that even possible to have such authentic faith? If he's got you there, he's got you right where he wants you, because what he's about to do is give you a counterintuitive twist to how God works. So here we have this shepherd who's been struck. So let's read verse 7 closely. If you have a Bible, I'm going to encourage you towards verse 7. And the Lord, in all caps, Yahweh, we would often say, the Father, he is the one speaking here, Lord of hosts. Here's what he says. He says, it's broken out in most Bibles poetically because it's figurative language. Awake, O sword. Let me pause right there. He is using figurative language for the symbol of God's judgment. Follow me on this. Sword doesn't actually mean sword. We know this. If you have time later, Jeremiah 47:6, he uses sword in this figurative language. When will your sword stop coming against us? When will your judgment stop coming against us? Romans 13 is where you might be more familiar with it, verses 4 and 5. He says that the government does not bear the sword for no reason. They are supposed to carry out the judgment of God. Well, not all governments bear swords. The point is, he's saying, awake, judgment. It's time to come against my shepherd. He says, strike in the next sentence. Strike the shepherd. But stay in verse 7. The shepherd is incredibly unique. Here's what he says. Sword, judgment, come against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me. Here's why this is unique. It's a Hebrew expression. The man who stands next to me. It literally means my associate is what the expression means. My associate, or we might say my right-hand man. Process this for just a second. God is saying, judgment come against the shepherd who's my right-hand man. Here's what we would anticipate. If you're a reader of Zechariah, you found out there's good and bad shepherds. Who should his judgment come against? The bad shepherd. He's saying, my judgment is going to come against my right-hand man, the good shepherd. If we hold that thought and flip to Matthew chapter 26. As I referenced earlier, Jesus thinks often on this passage from Zechariah, this idea of a struck shepherd. In Matthew 26, he has just concluded the Lord's Supper for the first time. If you're familiar with the Lord's Supper, it began in verse 26 of chapter 26. If we skip down, verse 30 says, and before they left that room, they sung a hymn. Then they went out on the Mount of Olives. Verse 31, then Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. The one standing next to God, that God says, judgment, destroy him, is Jesus Christ. Jesus is this shepherd who has been struck. Hopefully, if you were to read Zechariah through for the first time, it would be odd. My hope is that for us in the room, the idea that Jesus was struck is not odd. That we've heard it before. Here's what I think we possibly have neglected to do, though, is really faithfully carry it out. He says, as it is written, the shepherd is struck and the sheep are scattered. We've probably, I suspect, thought a lot about Jesus was struck. He was nailed to a cross, ultimately died this horrific death. How much time have we spent thinking about scattered sheep? What's the meaning of that? Why is that part in there? If you're a Christian, you are a sheep. What does it mean for you to be scattered? So here's where we need Zechariah. Matthew is pointing us back to Zechariah chapter 13. He says the sheep are going to be scattered. It's a very simple principle that if you can defeat the bully on the playground, if you can defeat the bully on the playground, all of his little underlings run for the hills. At least that's the theory. Didn't work for me. Didn't work for me. But that's the idea, is you defeat the main guy, you beat up the shepherd, his disciples, his sheep will be scattered. I think it's an understandable principle in that regard. But let me show it to you in Jesus' life real quickly. Jesus, the night he says the sheep will be scattered, was a Thursday. If you could go back to the previous Sunday, just a few days before, John chapter 12, verse 19 says this. So the Pharisees said to one another when Jesus rode in on a donkey, "You see that you are gaining nothing? You've made all these efforts to destroy this man's credibility, his reputation, all these things. You're gaining nothing." Here's what he says. "Look, the world has gone after him." What they're doing is they are seeing Jesus ride into town at the time of Passover. There's a big event going on, and Jesus overshadows it, and everybody is flocking to Jesus. He is by far the most popular man in town. So much so that the Pharisees who've been trying to take him down are discouraged. Like, look, the entire city is rallying to this guy. So by Thursday night, Jesus says, I'm going to be struck, Jesus will be struck, and all of you will scatter. To the disciples, it makes literally no sense. They're saying, Jesus, like they might come for you again, but it's not going to work. I mean, we are kind of kings in this town. So much so that back in Matthew 26, here's how it plays out. Verse 33, Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Yes, something might happen to you, but if nobody else sticks with you, I'm not going to be a scattered sheep. Then, verse 35, Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. They all commit, we will not be scattered. All of them are failing to see something. God said back in Zechariah, I'm intentionally striking the shepherd. I want all the sheep scattered. But they miss that. And they're dogmatic about it. We absolutely will never be scattered. We wouldn't dare. Here's what I appreciate. Mark walks through the scattering of the sheep. So Peter denies him 3 times. All the other disciples flee. Finally, you get down to Mark chapter 14, verse 51 and 52. He says, not only did everybody flee, there was one guy left. He goes, he's anonymous in Mark. I would suggest it might be Mark himself. He said, they grabbed him by the cloak, and he took off with no clothes on. You didn't know there's streakers in the Bible. There are. He takes off with no clothes on, and he says he ran for his life because everybody wanted to get away from Jesus. Let me show you what this is doing. This is answering a question for us. Have you ever thought about why did Jesus have to die the way he did? Why did he have to be arrested in such grand fashion and then go through all of these beatings leading up to dying on the cross? Why couldn't he have just been presented on the cross and breathed his last? Zechariah is giving us part of the answer. It would not have had the effect God intended. He wanted it to be so violent and gruesome and obvious that everyone associated with Jesus would go the other direction. He went from being the most popular man in town on Sunday to by Friday having no friends left. God wanted the sheep scattered. hopefully we're to the point of saying, why? Why would you strike the shepherd and scatter the sheep? His answer came back in Zechariah. He presents it this way. So you'll have to follow me along in verse 8. Follow along with me. He says, the whole land was scattered, declares the Lord. 2/3 shall be cut off and perish. 2/3 remain scattered. 1/3 shall be left alive. Jesus, in Matthew 26, he said, as it is written, the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will be scattered, but I will come to you in Galilee. He says, after everybody has fled, I'm going to gather you back in. The 2/3 and 1/3 are just poetic language, much like the talking sword. It's poetic language to convey this idea. God wanted Christianity to be a minority religion. That's interesting, isn't it? 2/3 will buy in that he's not worth sticking with. 1/3 comes back around. He says, I wanted it to be a minority religion. Jesus says it this way. The path that walks away from God is wide and many will be on it. Few will find the narrow gate and the hard path. Why does God want you to be in a minority position? Why does he want that? Why go through all of this scattering of the sheep and all this kind of thing to break it down to a minority position? Here's what he says. And he says, I will put this third, this minority, this small group, into the fire and refine them as one refines silver and test them as gold is tested. So here's what he's saying. If you're in a minority position, life will bring its challenges, and it will have the effect of putting you in a refining fire. Refining fire has been talked about a lot. What I find very fascinating is how the process occurred in Zechariah's day. In Zechariah's day, they would take gold or silver, put it into these pots, clay pots, and set it over a fire that they would keep roaring on average for 5 days. Because in the gold, as one commentator pointed out, you found a lot of impurities. Zinc and even salt were common in that ore, that lump of gold. But when they would heat it for 5 days, those impurities would get pushed towards the edges. They would naturally work their way out towards the clay. So at the end of 5 days, those impurities were easy to pick out. Let me rephrase it in the context of Zechariah. God intentionally has you in a spot that's going to be challenging as a minority faith on planet Earth. The challenge is purposeful. What it will do is it will force those idols you've had in your life out to the edges so they can be picked out. And it will make you this pure, authentic, real piece of gold, portion of silver. Because if you're in a minority position and everybody else says, hey, listen, if you want to be with us, you got to get on board. It will do something to your beliefs. It will change you from holding beliefs to holding convictions. And when you hold convictions, you draw a line in the sand. And you say, really, honestly, that's not what I'm about. I'm not really about that. I serve God. I can't go along with that. And that thing that might have been tempting to serve gets pulled out of your life. He says, I intentionally am going to strike the shepherd in a graphic, violent manner. So to bring you down to this minority position because there are things I want to work out of your life. Here's the beauty of it, though. That's the refining piece. He says it will also have the effect of testing. Does God need to test you to know what's in you? Short answer is no. He already knows what grade you would make. He doesn't need to test you. His testing of you is for your sake. Because when you get in that spot and you pull away from a majority position, and because of your convictions and your love for Jesus, you stand firm in Him, the testing gives you this assurance. I'm with God. I'm really with God. And it's an assurance that as long as there's some blurriness, you haven't had to be pulled apart yet from what you might associate with, that blurriness can cloud your mind. If you actually go through a difficult moment and you actually say there's a line in the sand I can't cross and I'm with Jesus, what you will experience is this final phrase. They are my people. The Lord is my God. I am really, really, really with Him. Because do you see what Zechariah has done? He's gone from that initial spot of people have idols, lots of gods, and he says, God Himself is going to carry out this process we would have never dreamed up. Strike the shepherd, scatter the sheep. It'll put you in a minority position, and this will produce something beautiful. I would have never in a million years, I would have said just the opposite. Truly, I really would have. I would have said, make Jesus followers the majority, and that will stomp out the idols. Making them the minority group? That doesn't make sense. And God says, precisely. Because my ways are greater than your ways. And He says, if you follow this system, you understand this system, you will go from having a bunch of gods to this statement that is very exclusive. The Lord is my God. All the other potential gods are gone. The Lord alone is my God. And God uses this very affirming phrase, you are my people. It really does produce that. Here's my hope for us, though. You realize this is how God works. Maybe let me give you the corrective real fast. Sometimes Christians think if life is hard and challenging, I must be doing it wrong. And there's a smiley guy on TV that would say, oh yeah, you're doing it way wrong. If you were doing it right, he would give you all of your hopes and dreams. Does that sound anything like this passage? I don't think it sounds even close. He says, I'm literally doing the opposite. I want to put you in a minority position so that when everything else is going one direction, you'll be forced to go the other direction and actually be a child of God. He says, if it's smiley, you've got the wrong God. So he's telling you how we interpret the world. He's saying for believers, it should look this way. Let me put it one other way. Europe right now is considered post-Christian. Let me rephrase it. Christians are an extreme minority in Europe right now. If I read it the way Zechariah talks about it, God is purposely making the Christians in Europe very Christian. That's a lot of refining going on. They are in an extreme minority position. For once, they're finally going to have to make a conviction and stick with it and say, the Lord is my God. And he's going to say, and those are my people. And they are going to be as pure as gold. Because I'm letting it go post-Christian. So you have to understand what he's saying. He's giving you the system. Here's how it works. If you're a child of God, don't be confused by somebody else, even if they come in a hairy cloak. So for us, believers, for those baptized today, the claim in baptism is the Lord is my God because I believe in a struck shepherd. And I want to walk this thing the rest of my days. If you're not a follower of Christ, I do find for those who don't have a relationship with Jesus, time and time again this comes up. Well, if Christianity is so good, why don't things work out for Christians? Because God didn't want them to. He actually wanted the opposite. I know. You think, I don't know that I want that. What I think you'll find if you get around a real authentic Christian is there's an appeal to it. And you're going to see something real in them you don't see anywhere else. You might just find that you have a little hesitancy rolling your God out in front of them because you know it's just not as real. I would encourage you, take note of that. God's working in that individual's life. For you to be in that position, it will require this, to make the same claim that's being baptized today made. Jesus alone is my God. Would you please stand as we sing this final song?